Welcome, friend. I am glad you are here, possibly hiding from your to-do list. Or maybe you just have a fascination for the truly strange side of bedtime stories. Tonight's episode might not help you sharpen any real-life skills unless you are suddenly called upon to run a kitchen in utter chaos. If you like gently odd adventures, hit that like button. Honestly, it only makes this less weird for me. Pop your local time and city in the comments. It is honestly baffling how many of you are wide awake on the other side of the world when I am half asleep over here. So lights low, blankets up, glass of something nearby. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Morning sneaks up on you like a herd of cows through a tent flap, loud, blunt, and without an ounce of courtesy. You are jarred from sleep not by an alarm, but by a cluster of voices crashing through the thin felt walls, each one competing to be the first to offend your eardrums. There is no gentle easing in. One moment, you are half dreaming about clear skies. The next, you are face to face with reality, the stale breath of sheep, the rank closeness of bodies, and a blanket that smells like it moonlights as a soup rag. You try to blink away the bleariness, but it clings to your face about as stubbornly as the smell in this place. A quick inhale drives the point home, that signature perfume of all the animals no one ever bothers to bathe, sharpened by just a hint of burning hair, because someone always throws too much kindling on the fire. No matter how you shift, there is no position in which you can avoid the smell of last night's lamb stew or the wafting promise of boiled fat. In the yurt, everyone is breathing each other's regret, and every blanket is just fabric pretending to be clean. Your right hand lands in something cold and damp. Patty of yesterday's broth or the leavings of a sheep who got too comfortable. It is best not to ask. You wipe it on your tunic, which was already halfway to ruin, and accept defeat. Two chickens, unimpressed by your attempts at dignity, flap out from under your makeshift cot and make an outraged racket. As you swing your legs over, your toes squish down into what you hope is just mud tracked in by last night's rain. Half the bedding slides off with you, trailing crumbs, hair, and something you sincerely wish had stayed outside. Outside is not much better. The air is thick with a dozen cooking fires, popping and snapping as someone nearby stirs a cauldron with the enthusiasm reserved for very strong grudges. Greasy smoke swirls unpredictably, lodging itself in your throat and stinging your eyes. The cooks are already roaring, some bellowing about onions, others squabbling over whose turn it is to face the pot of boiling offal. None of them offer you coffee. Someone thrusts a dented wooden bowl into your hands as soon as you make eye contact, and congratulations. You have been promoted from confused bystander to junior kitchen disaster. You shuffle past horses cropping the grass down to nothing, and try not to envy their obvious detachment from human affairs. The shouts grow louder. Someone has misplaced 3 ladles. Another has found half of one in the bottom of a stew. Children dash between legs, collecting anything not nailed down, while the grown-ups try to organize the chaos with more noise and little progress. You suspect most of these people have not slept, judging by the short tempers and vacant stares. Your first task is simple in that it involves no choices. Take a bucket, fetch more water, and try not to spill it or fall in. The walk to the river is a journey through a living obstacle course of hay, dung, and the occasional half-eaten turnip. The footing is never good. Your boots squelch on something best described as organic temperature, cold texture, suspiciously gelatinous. You try not to look down. It does not help. If you could call your old apartment right now, you would. The thought of thick-walled silence, a thermostat, and a shower that does not require apologizing to the livestock makes you wince. Out here, there is no buffer against sound, smell, or weather. You are cold, you are damp, and your only privacy is the fleeting moment when someone yells at someone else instead of you. By the time you return, your hands are numb, your nose is running, and the cooks are more frantic than ever. Someone gestures wildly for you to chop something, meat, root, possibly a sort of turnip that might also be a weapon. There are no measured recipes here. Someone dictates ingredient amounts by handfuls, others by shouts. Mostly it is guesswork and panic. You catch snippets of conversation. Which sheep is getting the axe? Whether anyone remembered the salt? The logistics of not poisoning the Khan through sheer carelessness. Boiling broth gurgles in the largest pot, spitting flecks of fat onto your already stained tunic. At some point, a dog steals a hunk of cheese from right under your hand. No one seems surprised. This is life before breakfast, and somehow you are awake, upright, and only lightly covered in sheep residue. You miss central heating with honest desperation. You miss mornings that began with nothing noisier than a phone buzz. Out here, you take what you get: crackling fires, insulted chickens, and an unspoken contest to see who can wake up the loudest. Welcome to early dawn in the Khan's camp. Comfort has left the building, but at least the day can only get different. You step inside what passes for a kitchen here, bracing yourself. The tent sags overhead, smoke bunching in corners and escaping only when the wind bothers to help. Every surface is either sticky or damp, or both. The entire space is a patchwork of battered wooden tables, scorched pots, and so many knives you start to rethink your life choices. Yesterday's greasy bones crunch underfoot, ghostly reminders of meals gone sideways. The air is thick with sweat, fire ash, and the unmistakable tang of raw mutton. If you are looking for the cheerful clatter of utensils, forget it. The nearest thing to ambience is the sound of fat spitting in cast iron, interrupted every so often by yelps when it finds someone's skin. You sidestep a boiling cauldron, watchful for rogue lumps of meat that occasionally leap out for freedom. Your colleagues stare through you with the sharp deadness that comes from too much work and too little sleep. Their hair sticks up, their hands are raw and cracked, and nobody bothers with conversation unless it is an order or an accusation. Someone hands you a cleaver and points at a mound of carcass. No instructions, only expectation. Nothing is labeled here. You guess what animal it used to be from the arrangement of bones. There is no fridge, only wind chill, and the kind of brisk temperature that keeps meat marginally less dangerous for half a morning. You hear the phrase head cook, and it conjures a doomed sense of hope, a leader, a professional presence. No, the head cook is more drill sergeant than chef, stalking the rows and grumbling at any sign of hesitation. His favorite trick is to materialize behind you and shout just as you fail to slice through a tendon or drop a greasy hunk of fat. Every mistake is announced to the room. Chop too slowly, too quickly, or too creatively, and you get a performance review in high volume. Your only instruction is basically, do not handicap breakfast. The animals being broken down were alive a few hours ago, and they still let you know it. Little puddles of blood gather beneath your elbows. The cutting boards all have histories you would rather not learn. Even the knives give off the faint aroma of hands, onions, and years of nervous sweat. Meal hygiene is theoretical. There really is no polite way to summarize the state of these surfaces. Anything resembling a cloth is already part of the soup. You would kill for a bottle of sanitizer, a plastic cutting board, or just a tap with running water. Your hands tack between sticky and slick, sometimes gritty. You try to clean them with sand or grass. No one seems to notice unless you accidentally splash broth onto the head cook's worn boots. Around you, the action never stops. Someone is always hacking through bone, heaving hunks of flesh into pots that gurgle and foam. Others peel onions with knives, so oversized they look, repurposed from an arsenal. The air flashes with embers and insult. The combined effect is something between a cooking show and a very small civil war. Orders get barked in 50 different directions. Arguments flame up over the seasoning, and whose fault it is that the salt barrel got kicked over. People grab each other's arms and shove bowls under noses for unwanted critiques. You lift a chunk of meat. It is still warm. You try not to think about how recently it was running around outside. When you look for a clean place to set it, you realize there are only dirty options. You pick the one with the fewest flies. Every task feels like an audition for not getting yelled at. If you chop badly, you are slow. If you rush, you are careless. And if you do it perfectly, you get promoted to stirring, the only job more dangerous, considering the scalding oil and mystery items floating by. In the middle of it all, you catch yourself daydreaming about a refrigerator with shelves you do not fear. Or just a microwave, a single sterile spoon, and no risk of losing a finger for seasoning issues. You would even settle for a faded takeout menu and delivery tracking that does not involve horses. It is impossible to imagine anyone here ever saying, "Is it gluten-free?" But you long for problems that small. Your feet stick to the floor in places, then slide in others. Wet straw mingles with animal hair, scraps, and so many vegetable peels that just standing still risks a twisted ankle. The cooks move by instinct, swerving around buckets of innards, and the occasional stray dog bouncing along underfoot in search of snacks. The head cook's shadow looms as you reach for a new task, never sure if you are about to be congratulated or publicly demoted. You feel a jolt every time your knife hesitates or your ladle sloshes over. There is always noise. Dishes clang, fire pops, people bellow. Sometimes someone tries to whistle and is immediately shouted down. The soundscape is harsh, relentless, impossible to tune out. At one point, you notice a cook quietly weeping into his onions, though it is hard to tell if it is exhaustion or just the fumes. Still, somehow, the chaos inches towards a bizarre kind of order. Piles of bread, platters of steaming meat, kettles that never stop boiling. You keep your head down, grateful for every moment you are not the center of the head cook's wrath. If you make it to the end of your shift with all fingers and minimal burns, you will call that a win. And maybe, just maybe, you will never complain about washing dishes at home again. Now you get a look at the spread planned for tonight. To call it a menu is a bit optimistic, more like a dare disguised as hospitality. Picture the scene: a long, battered table bearing the edible remains of half a menagerie. There are mountains of roasted lamb and beef, glistening and hissing, and towers of skewered horse meat stacked with a kind of enthusiasm. you do not usually see outside of competitive eating, but it is the smaller dishes that really grab your worry. Bowls overflowing with slivers of kidney, glistening slices of tongue, arranged with unnerving care, and more than a few steaming platters of things that honestly defy polite translation. Stomach-lining stews bubble quietly, releasing an aroma that walks the difficult line between interesting and actively challenging. At the center sits a proud pile of what someone claims is fermented mare's milk cheese. That might sound innocent enough until you get a whiff, a sharp tang that scours the sinuses and hints at unfinished business between the cow and destiny. Every food group is here, provided you consider hooves and fat their own categories. The cooks boast loudly of their ability to turn knuckle, spleen, or pretty much any internal mystery into something, if not edible, then at least not fatal. Joints and cartilage get the honor of slow rendering in fat, crackling and chewy, intended for those who like dinner to fight back a little. The true delicacies, the items everyone pretends to love and secretly avoids, are reserved for the Khan and his unlucky favorites. Think slurpy sheep's eyeballs poached until they almost blink again, or a careful arrangement of boiled testicles that merit an entire inspection. You watch as a cook wipes a bowl with what might be clean cloth, then sets down a steaming stew that smells, if you are generous, like the inside of a wrestler's boot. No one blinks. Everyone here knows which dishes are high status, which are peasant fodder, and which are there because everyone is itching to see who actually eats them. There is a cruel pride in offering the most alarming plate to the boldest guest, something between hospitality and a practical joke passed down generations. You, as kitchen helper, lurk hopefully by the bread stacks, eyeing the flat, charred loaves like an old friend. Stale bread is the safest option, unless the fermented butter makes your tongue try to escape. Imagine your pickiest friend taking a seat here. The one who picks mushrooms out of a pizza or reads every allergy label twice. Now hand them a bowl of jellied sheep's head with a spoon carved from last year's wishbone. No ingredient lists, no polite substitutions. Your only warning before a food allergy is your own personal reaction time. Here, you eat what you are handed, or you become the entertainment. At some point, a cook urges you to try something. A dumpling filled with what tastes suspiciously unidentifiable, its texture suggesting an internal organ you are glad not to have studied. You chew bravely, searching your memory for simpler times. A bag of chips, boxed macaroni, even a lukewarm granola bar from the back of your desk. Anything that does not threaten to wobble or remind you where it came from. So, as the Khan's table fills with dishes that blur the line between feast and test of will, you suddenly understand the value of boring modern snacks. Salty, safe, generally incapable of staring back. No allergy warnings, no guessing, just pure, comforting blandness. But here, courage at the dinner table is not optional. It is the main course. Now look past the Khan's gilded plates and consider the real challenge. Feeding the endless crowd that trails him from horizon to horizon. Forget about quiet, intimate dinners. Think stampede. The army, the servants, the entire extended family and half the countryside. Everyone expects to eat, and no one is ever shy about reminding you. The supply system is refreshingly direct. Livestock travels with you. Sheep, goats, cattle, and horses all jam themselves between tents, as if they are waiting for a table at an overcrowded restaurant. Your food does not need delivering. It needs herding, managing, and occasionally chasing down when a particularly spirited goat decides it values life over lunch. For variety, there are sacks of dried curds so tough they could double as defensive weapons, and barrels of arag, fermented mare's milk, that sours enthusiastically in the Mongolian sun. There is always a faint background panic about whether you have enough barrels, enough milk, or just enough tolerance for another day of slightly intoxicating yogurt. Logistics are less spreadsheet, more frantic shouting. Inventories are kept by whoever shouts loudest and remembers best. Lose track of how many sheep survived last night's cold snap, and you might find yourself assigned to the grisliest fix-it job since sheep were invented. Counting sacks of flour becomes a philosophical exercise. Are you counting the sacks, or what is left inside after the mice finish their portion? Feeding this many people turns every meal into an exercise in controlled chaos. Piles of bread are baked and vanish almost instantly, dwarfed by the scale of the operation. Enormous vats of soup appear, then disappear nearly as quickly, slurped, spilled, or claimed by opportunistic dogs. There are no leftovers, only the nagging suspicion that half the men are still hungry and the other half have hidden second helping somewhere under their cloaks. Running out of food is not an option, and if you do, the consequences are not exactly subtle. Soldiers get irritable. Officers get creative with discipline. If you oversalt the meat, someone might finally notice just how much you contribute, a dubious honor, since there is no HR department waiting to mediate. Slip up and your review comes at top volume, in front of everyone, often with gestures best described as legally actionable. At least you never worry about a customer complaint form or a negative online review. Here, feedback is swift and features a lot more shouting. Forget to feed the right person, and you risk sparking a feud or, at the very least, an evening of urgent problem-solving that ends with you somewhere out in the dark, counting sheep with a new appreciation for the phrase, job security. Waste management is a charming oversimplification. Piles of bones get thrown into a communal dump with all the other unhappy leftovers. Dog heaven, if not exactly environmentally sensitive. No recycling bins, no compost plans. Nobody here asks about food miles or organic certification. The only sustainability report you ever see is whether there are still enough animals alive to keep the camp moving tomorrow. You cultivate a grudging respect for anything that does not spoil by midday or wander off on its own legs. Try to keep track of who eats what, and you will quickly lose the thread. Dozens of family groups, hundreds of soldiers, all with their own priorities and their own ideas of what counts as a hot meal. Portion sizes are measured by wild guesswork and the threat of immediate reprisal. If you thought organizing a potluck was stressful, try divvying up an entire ox with 3 knives and the equivalent of half a school auditorium waiting in line. Somehow, with just shouting, trampling, and a lot of luck, everyone is fed. You find yourself regretting every time you complained about your food delivery app being 5 minutes late, or the fries arriving tragically soggy. At least, you never had to chase down dinner, or negotiate the complex honor system of who gets the plumpest slice of liver. By the end of your kitchen shift, success is declared not because anyone is full, but because nearly everyone is not fighting about it. For now, that counts as a win. So next time you watch your dinner arrive through the insulated glass of your front door, take a quiet moment for the unsung heroes who, centuries ago, fed the world with nothing but livestock on a leash and a whole lot of shouting. No tracking numbers, no sustainability audits, just piles of food, buckets of nerve, and a single universal truth. Someone, somewhere, is always hungry. You have survived the stew, the smoke, and the head cook's tirades. But now comes the main event, serving the Khan and his terrifyingly attentive guests. The food is paraded out with military ceremony, even if most dishes still look like something best left unexplored. The spectacle is impressive. All gleaming platters, piles of steaming meat, and a lineup of cooks pretending not to sweat. Your own job is simple. Do not mess up, and if you do, try not to do it in front of the Khan himself. Here is where the etiquette grows fangs. Before the Khan lifts a single chopstick, there is a gauntlet of food tasters. The chosen few. You are not first string. Thank whatever gods look after kitchen assistants, but you are close enough to see every nervous swallow. The process is not exactly subtle. Each taster is served a portion, the room is silent, and every eye is locked on the slightest twitch. You can feel the tension. Half the people in the tent are worried about the food. The other half are scanning for evidence that someone might drop dead in the next 60 seconds. Awkward silence. That is the baseline. Every time a tester wipes his mouth, clears his throat, or looks faint, the whole tent nearly faints with him. It feels less like a dinner and more like high-stakes theater, cutlery poised, faces rigid, waiting for a cue you really hope never comes. Someone coughs on a piece of gristle, and 15 people glance sharply at the bowl, the cook, and the heavens. You stand just off to the side, tray in shaking hands, inwardly conducting your own risk assessment. Is the meat too pink? Did the head cook look too smug? Was that last bowl of stew supposed to have that much floating on top? Your modern instincts, used to color-coded restaurant health grades, and the smug certainty of sanitized kitchens, are no use here. Survival is based on expert-level paranoia and ancient family recipes for poison detection. Step 1. Stare at the victim. Step 2. Keep staring. Sometimes the suspense overshoots. Maybe someone tries a delicacy that is a touch more eye of sheep than expected. Or perhaps an undercooked dumpling causes a wave of side-eye across the noble benches. If someone hesitates, if anyone gags, the rest of the room freezes hard enough to ice over the soup. The Khan himself barely blinks, but you catch a general sliding his cup away, just in case the Arag suddenly develops ambition. Then there is the mandatory table drama. A cousin accuses a rival of getting the bigger yak bone. Two uncles launch into a low-voiced argument about whose turn it is to butter the bread. Occasionally, food is flung, not in anger, just tradition layered with pettiness. It all happens under the careful gaze of the Khan, who would quite like to enjoy his dinner without it turning into a murder mystery. You will never look at a restaurant hostess the same way again. These silent, uncomfortable moments make you yearn for a simple B grade in the window, and a napkin folded by someone whose greatest threat is running out of ketchup. Here, table service is as much about political survival as it is portion sizes. Everyone is equal parts hungry, proud, and on edge. In the end, the first taster does not collapse. The table relaxes minimally. The food is finally served, with a cautious enthusiasm that says, "Yes, we are glad to be eating." but possibly not this. You keep your head down, counting your lucky stars and the seconds until you can slip back to the smoky sanctuary of the kitchen, where the only poison is the soup. As darkness settles and the outside world fades into nothing but stars and cold, life inside the Khan's great tent explodes in the opposite direction, noisy, crowded, and absolutely done with any sense of decorum. The meal may have started with a whiff of caution, but that ended the second someone shouted for the arag. Suddenly, every drinking vessel is in play, a contest to see who can drain the most fermented mare's milk, and who can do so without it coming straight back up. The scent of the place is now an evolving nightmare. Sour arag, greasy lamb, sweat, and a championship blend of spilled stew and trampled bread. You try to find a patch of floor that is neither sticky nor suspiciously warm. No luck. Every time someone passes, a splash of something lands on your boot or your sleeve. You stop asking questions and start making peace with the laundry realities of 12th century life. Arag brings out both the worst and the loudest in people. Cousins challenge each other to drinking duels, complete with elaborate, slurred boasts about legendary tolerance and stomachs lined with iron. The losers get creative with excuses, or just get creative with where they deposit their dignity. Meanwhile, the cooks, finally off duty, crowd together at the margins, eyeing the chaos with that blend of exhaustion and grim amusement you only get after an 18-hour shift. Songs burst forth, sometimes melodic, often more ambitious than technically accurate. Old warriors bellow hunting tales in half-remembered verses, while the youngest pass around the bony remains of dinner, using them as makeshift drums. At least two guests invent lyrics on the spot about the general's lopsided haircut, and instead of offense, it turns into another chorus. The smell of breath heavy with fermented milk drifts like a warning and a dare. Halfway through the night, wrestling breaks out. Startled sheep barely escape as two men topple across the carpet, rolling through a pool of what might be soup, or just an unfortunate combination of spilled drinks. People wave scraps of meat, cheering for their favorite contender. Someone upends a pot for a drum roll, sending oil onto the feet of anyone slow to dodge. Arguments flare just as fast. A minor squabble over gravy quickly escalates into a prolonged debate about whose yak once won a foot race, traces of pride clinging sturdily to each absurd claim. You, meanwhile, are just trying to stay clear of elbows and wine-sloshed stories. Your brain aches with the blend of laughter and headache-inducing noise, and the longing for a glass of water, actual water, that has not spent a season inside a goat's skin, becomes a quiet daydream. The concept of noise-canceling headphones now feels like a half-remembered fable, fit for a shaman's bedtime story. You settle for cupping your ears now and then, not that it helps. Somewhere near midnight, the volume peaks. A song crashes into a toast, which becomes a round of half-hearted wrestling that spills into the lap of the oldest aunt, who takes it with a glare, then a laugh, then a stern threat about the next person who touches her plate. The food that remains is more floor decoration than nutrition, and the dogs make peace with their luck, weaving expertly under discarded bones and sticky footprints. If this all sounds exhausting, it is, but it is not unkind. There is warmth here, even if it comes with a side of spilled cheese juice and bruised shins. The exhaustion is old, honest, and shared by everyone around you. For a moment, as you watch people lean on each other, singing, arguing, dozing into their bowls. You realize this is as close as it gets to comfort after a day this demanding. Even the mess seems to settle, turning the whole tent into something that, if you squint hard enough, might be called cozy. Just noisy, sticky, and inescapably alive. The last song is little more than a mumble. Someone snores in a corner, and you are left blinking in the aftermath, definitely not as an honored guest, but as an official member of the cleanup squad. Congratulations. If you have ever tried to sneak out of a party before dishes start, you will find the urge familiar. Here, there is no door to slip through, just a thin tent wall and too many people watching for a disappearing act. The carnage is breathtaking. Every surface is glazed with fat, sauces you do not remember cooking, and the sort of crumbs that require chisels, not cloths. Bones litter the floor, sheep, goats, possibly the sole survivor of a chicken uprising, half-gnawed and artistically arranged in a pattern only a hungry dog could love. You discover puddles of arag in places arag should not be, sticky trails winding off toward the entrance, evidence of someone's optimistic stumble. Nobody has invented trash bags, and that is obvious. Instead, there is just you, a few equally unlucky companions, and a collection of battered buckets and ancient, threadbare rags. You stare at your hands and miss rubber gloves on a level that borders on spiritual. Instead, it is skin on everything. And if there is a less dignified task than scooping cold fat and congealed stew from a sagging yurt mat, you would like to never discover it. The system for distributing duties is simple. Whoever looks busiest or the least physically present gets yelled at last. So everyone moves at a slow shuffle, eyes on the ground, arms full of dirty platters, hoping the next round of bellowing is directed elsewhere. You try the ancient shuffle lean, an attempt to merge with the tent's geometry, and become both invisible and unnecessary. It almost works, until someone tosses you a ladle sticky with bits you would rather not name, and points you toward a mountain of crusty bowls. Scraping pots is a grim exercise. Bits of blackened broth cling like barnacles. Chunks of ligament resist every attempt at removal, and oil manages to slip everywhere except into the bucket. You reach for a clean cloth, but there are only varying shades of dirty, each one quickly joining the ranks of the irredeemable. Rinse water is fetched from a distant barrel and changes color from clear to unsettling in record time. There's a lot of muttered negotiation. If you wash the bone knives, maybe someone else will haul the soup kettle out for a scrub. Spoiler, you end up doing both. Meanwhile, the guests sleep soundly, blissfully immune to the festival of dish scraping and grease wrestling unfolding under their noses. Dogs patrol for edible scraps with military precision, and the youngest cousin, conveniently missing during the feast, reappears to hand out completely unhelpful advice. Someone drops a tray with a noise that echoes straight through your skull, and all you can do is accept your fate. There is no shortcut to sunrise, only more dishes and creative new residues to discover. By the time the last bowl is stacked, your hands are numb, your back aches, and you carry the combined scent of mutton, smoke, and defeat. You glance around and catch the quiet, universal look between cleanup crew members everywhere, a mixture of exhausted pride and a half-hearted promise to never attend another party ever again. Then, silently, you all start searching for clean water or the closest approximation. Somewhere in the blurry early hours, You let your mind wander to the future. Dishwashers whirring politely, recycling bins waiting at the curb, take-out containers you can simply toss without existential dread. You convince yourself that if you ever see a pile of greasy plates again, you will thank them for their modern, disposable charms. Or maybe just order pizza next time and leave the box for someone else. In the meantime, you head for your straw mat, smelling like the kitchen and feeling every bit a survivor. The party is over, but the memory, like fat on your hands, will linger. So you have made it, through dawn's livestock alarm clock, the not-so-sanitary kitchen trials, and the kind of meal prep that could double as a stress test for anyone's nerves. You have spent the night dodging elbows, spoons, song lyrics, and more than a few puddles with questionable origins. And of course, you now understand that midnight feasts are far less magical when you have to scrub out the pots afterward. Looking back, it is impressive what a group of sleepy, slightly desperate people can do with enough yelling, enough animals, and zero help from modern plumbing. Feeding an empire, or just a very demanding dinner guest, used to mean chaos, improvisation, and embracing a level of mess that today would send most kitchens into cardiac arrest. Tonight's ordeal probably makes your microwave and your stack of clean dishes look a little more heroic than usual. It is nice, sometimes, to remember how many problems can be solved by delivery apps, plastic forks, or simply not yak milking for a living. Still, there is something honest about all that effort, the long list of small disasters, the teamwork, even the hours spent searching for a clean patch of floor. In the end, you get to relax where you are, warm, mostly clean, and blissfully out of range of midnight onion duty. If you take a slow breath and notice the silence around you, that is victory enough. After all, some feasts you are meant to survive, not savor, and cozy calm, with nary a single sheep in sight, suits you just fine. A pale, grainy dawn seeped between the battered eaves of Lynn's family workshop, the weak shape of light catching on the littered scraps of bark and pulp that lay across the flagstones like the remnants of a vanished snow. Luoyang, the old capital, pressed endlessly beyond the thin wooden doors, its lane stalls empty, its walls pockmarked and tremulous. The city's great pulse now a weak, uncertain flutter. Yet here, deep in the belly of a paper mill bequeathed to him by a father whose hands still seemed present in every tool and timber, Lynn moved amidst ritual more ancient than any dynasty. A fresh day began with an inventory of hurt, roof tiles broken by stray arrows 3 winters ago, vats scarred with 1,000 boilings and left unrepaired for want of coin, the spring water cistern nearly empty, the trickle within it heavy with silt and regret. Outside, Luoyang streets, once embroidered with traders and scholars, had grown thin with suspicion. Lynn sensed it in the silent way people queued at the well, in the taut-spined scurrying of children, in the way lanterns now winked out before midnight, blind against the festering dark. Rumors of the rebel Huang Keo's advance swarmed through the market like flies. A distant thunder at first, becoming a pulse in Lynn's own blood as the weeks drew on. He clung to his life's work as if to memory itself, even as each order for his finest giant paper dwindled, as officials and poets slipped away, and only nervous clergy or desperate merchants came, begging for rough sheets fit only for ledgers or temple offerings. Within the mill, a low, timbered structure on the edge of town. The scents were complex: water, wood ash, steamed mulberry bark, and the faint, metallic note of anxiety. Lin's hands, calloused and deft, moved by habit. He soaked the soft inner rind, listening to its sighs as fibers loosened in the warm basin. He squeezed and beat, the wooden pestle rising and falling in a rhythm older than the city's tangled streets, his father's rhythm and his before. The slurry poured into shallow molds, lifted with a slow swirl so that the mesh caught the floating, dancing threads. He tilted, drained, pressed, until the pulp knit itself into the thinnest cradle of possibility, paper so translucent it quivered in the breeze, itself a kind of spirit caught from water and tree. Each step conjured ghosts. Lin remembered his father's voice, low and patient, explaining the virtues of slowness. Disharmony lives in haste. Let the water instruct you. When war and hunger pressed close, when neighbors fled westward, clutching what they could, Lin buried himself deeper in the cycle of soaking and shaping, flattening and drying, rescuing frail seeds of the past from the crosswinds of unrest. He worked by lamplight after curfew, the mill's latticed windows bound shut to muffle the world's chaos, the candle guttering in his shadow. Sometimes a page would tear or crumple, and Lin, hands trembling, would press his fingers to the pulp, whispering a small apology to the ruined sheet, as if failing it meant failing memory itself. For beyond the doors, the empire's flesh was riven. Soldiers' boots cut up the crocus fields. The noise of distant torches, clamoring and hungry, sometimes thudded inside Lin's ribs when the night grew especially thin. Yet here, there was a holy defiance in the continuation of craft, a whisper of order as great things collapsed. Even as his neighbors swept away their fortunes, sold their tools, or agreed to work for the rebels in hope of mercy, Lin held to the shuddering pulse of the mill, hands soaked, skin chafed raw. He clung to the making not out of blind devotion, but because in each damp sheet he drew forth something of Luyang endured. When he paused, letting the day's efforts rest in silent rows beside the drying frame, Lin peered at the dust in the high rafters and wondered, was there a future left for such labor? The world needed grain, iron, arms, all louder claims than the whisper of brush on paper. Yet how would it remember itself when the fighting passed, and those who survived needed songs or records, prayers or laws? Would the art die quietly with him, or would some thin thread stretch forward, invisible but unbroken? Twilight found Lin at the mill's edge, gazing out over the city's slumping rooftops, his breath ghosting in the cold. The sky was the color of old manuscripts, bruised and veined. As night crowded in, the mill's silence became a prayer, one that rose upward, joining the smoke from many ruined hearths, searching for an answer, or perhaps only the grace of quiet endurance. By morning, the sorrowful hush of the city was broken only by those duties that could not be deferred. Water drawn, hearth stoked, rations weighed on trembling hands. Lin knelt by the mill's rear window, tracing the slow wander of sunlight as it gathered in golden pools on scraps forgotten overnight. Paper, when finished, resembled nothing at all, light, silent, almost empty, yet buried within each pale, wavering sheet dwelt a myriad of secrets. Some were little more than the ghost print of Lin's own touch. Others held the history of a world dissolving, syllable by syllable, into uncertainty. The day's first visitor arrived when Lin was weighing dry bark for another batch. A scholar monk swaddled against the cold, robes patched, but neat, his beard trimmed like a brush. Even in these times, Lin recognized the sheen of discipline in the old man's bearing. They exchanged shallow bows, words unnecessary between those who cherished the art of silence. The monk laid thin slips across the work table, broken fragments of poetry, prayers, appeals for mercy, scribed on panels that had once gleamed with prosperity's excess. Now hastily stitched and reused, the texts invoked both endurance and loss. "Ink will keep what lips dare not," the monk offered quietly, his voice cracked by dusk and fasting. Lin gathered the sheets and read in the calligraphy a trembling, some hurried, some beautifully deliberate, tiny birds of brush dancing on battered parchment. He wondered to himself how many secrets hid in the fading sweep of character's tale, in the bold point of a plea. How many lives, riven by fear or hope, made their last confidences to paper now threatened by storm and scarcity. Wordless, he set to work with the monk watching. The process of paper-making was less ceremony than gentle invocation. Bark softened and torn, pounded until the fibers were like breath, water poured and swirled with careful restraint. The mix spread thin and true over the mold. He gestured for the monk to approach, to observe closely. "Here, see, how the ink will flow in fibers if not pressed true," Lin murmured. The monk watched the weave, his gaze bright. They spoke of little things, the right temper of rice straw, the proper time to raise a fresh batch to the air. But the real exchange lay elsewhere, an unspoken trust that knowledge must be passed even if the city around them collapsed. Lin guided his guest's hands, showing how to lift and tilt so that the pulp settled into an even skin. The old man, for all his authority, looked momentarily like a child, his jaw slack with awe and humility. As dusk crept from the corners, they unpinned a clutch of newborn pages from their drying cords. Simple, almost unseen save by those who knew the craft's blessing. The monk produced a brush, black ink sweeping swift from root to tip, and painted a single character on the damp sheet: "Endure." In this ritual, Lin felt the marrow of lineage, his father and his father's father, echoing in the hush that followed. But secrets were not only in what was written. Lin's eye fell on one peculiar sheet, marked not with brush, but with a pressed symbol, hidden in the layering of fibers. A clandestine stamp used to whisper allegiance or warning beneath official eyes. No one in Luoyang had brought such a request before. Lin studied the mark, a coiled dragon, its head entwined in a knot, then looked at the monk, waiting. The old man merely nodded, as if Lin's curiosity was a kind of propriety. He knew then that the rebellion drew ever closer, threading its networks through temples and workshops, embedding orders and courage in ways only paper could unlock. What he crafted was no longer just for poetry or prayer, but for conspiracies, for hope on the run. Outside, night deepened. Somewhere far off, a patrol's torch guttered, a trumpet stammered, and Lin wondered what new history was being pressed into the very fibers of his labor. A city's fears, a rebellion cipher, or some last confession that would outlast fire and sword. The monk took his completed sheets and vanished into the cold, a figure returning to his precarious duty. Alone again, Lin felt both heavier and oddly unburdened. The ink now held burdens for other hands, its secrets safe within the weave he had shaped. Again, he kindled his lamp, sitting at the low writing desk to record the day's recipe and the stranger's mark. His calligraphy, though modest, was steady. As if, by writing, he might tether himself to the continuity the city so desperately needed. A thread, fragile and secret, binding past to future as the world creaked and shifted beyond his splintering walls. Days swollen by unease unfurled into brittle weeks. The pulse of conflict, distant at first, bled steadily nearer, until Liu Yang's air was restless with the footfalls of uncertainty. Even as the outer quarters braced for flames and looting, Lin's mill acquired a strange, shadowed industry. Orders arrived couched in secrecy. A terse message smuggled in a tea wrapper, coins heavy with dirt or hidden in bundles of dried flowers. A hurried knock at dusk. These were no longer commissions for artistry or remembrance, but for survival. Sheets thin enough to conceal, quick drying, meant for coded decrees and invisible treaties. Lin found himself fashioning not only paper, but also the silent currency of insurrection. Neutral though his heart wished to be, the mill's peace had become porous, its very timbers occupied by the shifting will of the city. The workers who occasionally aided him, two sisters from the south, once hired to sweep scraps, but now trained, at Lin's urging, in the precise measures of pulp and screen, labored with furtive diligence. Fear gave a clipped intensity to their motions. At night, they stitched together stories overheard at water stalls, guessing how the newest demand mapped to rumors of rebel advance or imperial retreat. One evening, as moonlight slid in fractured beams across the floor, Lin was startled by an urgent intrusion. 3 men appeared, garbed neither as monks nor officials, but wrapped in anonymity, travel-stained cloaks, faces angled downward. Their leader, a gaunt man with hawk's eyes, unrolled a scroll on Lin's table, its surface embossed with another cryptic motif. 2 crossed swords, bleeding into a single river. No names were spoken. "We need 50 by the end of next night," the man said softly. Silent, exacting. If these fall into the wrong hands, an entire scheme ends in blood. The stakes now trembled in every gesture, every choice. Where Lin once measured bark by fingers and intuition, he weighed each handful as if his conscience hung in the balance. He crafted the sheets in darkness, working by memory alone when the oil gave out, careful that each print showed no watermark to betray its origin. When the sisters questioned him, eyes flickering with distrust, he spoke softly of duty, reminding them that even paper must choose its allegiance in a world torn by fire. During those nights, Liu Yang's atmosphere became a fever of whispered signals, the distant ring of bells warning of fire, the coded clap of hands along alleys, the flicker of shadow as rebels or loyalists crept from street to street. The city's river carried rumors downstream. The mill, too, became a quiet part of this underground stream, its product moving invisibly from hand to trembling hand. Through it all, Lin's own beliefs wavered. He remembered childhood mornings when his father spoke of imperial envoys seeking the finest parchment, of scholars who believed a country bound together was paper's true vocation. But what were country and kin now, with every wall stained by betrayal? One morning, as he watched the pulp swirl in its tub, threads tangled and separating, reconvening by some unspoken order, Lin pondered whether the craft itself was being unmade. Was paper now seed for discord rather than record? Was his calling an accomplice to chaos, or was it a last tether of civilization in the teeth of destruction? He moved with new caution, seldom sleeping. Once, late to bolt the door after a delivery, he glimpsed soldiers ransacking a neighbor's shop for suspected enemy pamphlets. The echo of shattered roof tiles haunted Lin as he hurried inside, the taste of dread sharp in his throat. Amid the grinding cycles of pulp and drying, every movement seemed to leave a trace, each footprint in the dust heavier with consequence. Yet even in these crucible hours, the act of making paper anchored him. Each completed order, no matter for whom, carried in its weave a silent defiance of oblivion. In the scented hush that followed a batch's pressing, he whispered private questions into the steam. Could something so fragile bear the weight of a world at war? Could a thing made for poetry and worship survive as weapon, yet somehow retain a whisper of its former hymn? Wind rattled the windows. Far off, the clangor of arms rose and receded. Through it all, the old process endured in Lin's hands, even transformed. It was still the labor of binding, shaping, redeeming. He understood now that war was fought not only in open courtyards or along the city's battered gates, but also beneath the fingertips of those who shaped the silent bearers of truth and deception, hope and grief. His paper, as alive and fugitive as the city itself. A brittle whisper of frost lined the thresholds as Lin woke to what would be the mill's last true day of work. Around him, Luyang exhaled with a heaviness born not of fear, but resignation, a city awaiting siege, its markets sunk in exhaustion, the river swollen with flotsam from hastily abandoned homes. Within these withering walls, Lin's world shrank further still. Orders had slowed, but the requests that arrived were breathless with urgency. Each bore the character of quiet desperation, dispatches stuffed into bamboo tubes, coded pleas from distant quarters, a poem smuggled out with a fading seal. The craft was no longer commerce, not even really survival. It was duty emptied of reward, meaningful only insofar as it outlasted its own necessity. In these hours, Lin worked alone. The sisters, whose loyalty had survived longer than most, were gone with the last southbound caravan, leaving a lingering note pressed between mulberry leaves that wished him strength and forgiveness. He stood for a while in the cold morning light, pressing his palm to the doorframe, tracing the ghosts of their laughter. The mill, emptied of other voices, became cavernous, the scuff and brush of his sandals on the stone floor echoing like a rite. The morning's labor he approached not as a tradesman, but as a penitent. In the faint murmur of boiling water and the deliberate folding of rag and bark, he sensed a reckoning. The process, now, was a prayer for continuity amid collapse. He prepared the final batch with the utmost care, selecting the last stores of bleached pulp and the oldest vat, its scarred rim gleaming with the memory of 1,000 pressings. Tension curled around every gesture, a sense that, while the city might soon fall, craft itself demanded a last, perfect effort, a refusal to let decline be synonymous with carelessness. Lin's hands trembled, not from haste as in the flurried nights of conspiracy, but from a poignant certainty that this was the culmination of not one, but generations of labor. He soaked the fibers with water drawn from the last cask, its taste tinged by rust and patience, stirred the slurry with slow reverence, as if coaxing from the mix a fragment of the peace that had always eluded him. Drawing the mold through the pulpy bath, he watched each delicate mesh catch its brief harvest, an act impossibly gentle amid a history now shattered. As the sheets formed and the final batch began its transformation, memories wove through Lin's thoughts with a clarity sharper than any present fear. He recalled the shy pride in his father's gaze when he first managed a flawless sheet, the wide wonder in a scholar's eyes upon tracing a flawless surface, the laughter that had once filled the mill with a kind of invincibility. These recollections lived in the motion of pressing and lifting, as if each gesture could conjure again a vanished inheritance. News from the city seeped in through rumor and distant tumult, gates barricaded, fires smoldering in the herbalist's quarter, strange banners glimpsed above the rooftops. Yet within the mill, time folded in on itself, past stitched invisibly to present in the rhythm of soaking, draining, hanging, pressing. The world receded to small certainties. The cool texture of wet fiber, the faint, sweet bitterness of steam, the heavy scent of aging wood. Here, where fate and history converged, Lin understood effort itself as its own testament. If these final sheets were never delivered, if they smoldered away in some future conflagration, still the act of shaping them offered a last refusal. A declaration, not to audience or authority, but to the possibility of remembrance. Late afternoon found Lin methodically pinning the glimmering new pages to their cords, each trembling as the air cooled and dusk pressed in. For the first time, he painted his own message onto a half-dry sheet, a single character drawn with deliberate slowness: remain. The stroke, thicker than tradition allowed, bled gently at the edges before settling into quiet finality. He had never dared offer myth or prophecy, nor believed himself a preserver of more than small technique, but looking upon the character, he glimpsed for a moment the silent commandment at the heart of all making: endure by transforming, remember by remaking. It was both origin and farewell. Nightfall overtook Luyang with uncommon swiftness, shrouding the city in shadow traced by the flicker of distant torches and the brittle snapping of banners above the city walls. Lin, exhausted, sat beside the last suspended row of drying sheets. The sounds of siege, muffled clangs, sudden cries, radiated in broken waves, but inside the mill, only the steady creak of wood and the thin drip of condensation marked time. In the stillness, something within him relaxed. He found a ledger left by his father, pages soft from years of thumbed corners and faded ink. Lin leafed through gentle records, a list of ingredients, a praise from a forgotten official, notes on the merits of various woods, finally penciling a brief entry of his own: finished now. May the craft wander but not vanish. Closing the book, he placed it in a clay jar alongside a single flawless sheet and a sliver of mulberry bark, sealing these small relics as an offering to unpredictability and the half-seen future. He extinguished the lantern, allowing the dark to reclaim the mill's familiar shapes. Whether the rebels would seize this place or it would join the ash drifting through Luyang, Lin no longer struggled with the answer. His final batch, a river of handmade silence, trembling in the dark, belonged to no victor. It was a remnant, an unspooling legacy, left for hands yet unknown. Long after the uprising's fury had passed, and the old city's name became half a whisper in distant provinces, memory flickered in the thinnest places. Luyang rebuilt itself in hesitant layers, new streets traced over old scars, shrines tended with trembling hands, the marketplaces lit with the wary laughter of survivors. Where fire once ravaged roofs and banners, where ink decrees became mere gusts, the vanished mill stood silent, a hollowed shell swallowed by weeds and weather. Yet something endured in the hush between each new beginning, a secret embedded in the fabric of the city's air. Paper, so slight it once seemed, proved indelible in its secrecy. Lin's craft, invisible to the hawkers and children who grew up playing in the ruined lane, had ceded a brittle inheritance. Bundles of tattered sheets resurfaced in improbable places, found in attic trunks by merchants from distant towns, uncovered, folded inside the footstools of a poet's study, carried downriver with battered statues to some monastery deep in the hills. Most bore only fragments, snatches of orders, sketches of birds, columns of hasty script. But a rare few, pressed more carefully and marked by an unfamiliar hand, told of endurance. These sheets, smoother than any produced in frightened haste, carried not just dispatch or confession, but the ghost glimmer of tradition unwilling to yield. It was in one such fragment, unearthed centuries later from beneath a temple altar, that a single inked character lingered, its edge blurred but sturdy upon the faded sheet. Remain. A monk, leafing through the frail slip, murmured the syllable to himself, as if tasting a memory grown strange. To him, the word was more than a scrap of wisdom. It was the tremor of a world that had chosen, in its hour of greatest dissolution, to leave behind not mere record but admonition. In distant corners of the empire, rumors of the lost craftsmen of Luoyang became legend among itinerant scholars, their stories revised with each retelling. Some insisted a lone artisan had held the city's fate in his hands, his sheets conspiracies and prayers in disguise. Others spoke of a sacred process carried over mountains by fleeing apprentices, how a ritual of bark, water, and silence had crossed borders, taking new form in strange dialects and unfamiliar tools. Meanwhile, the records of the great families, rescued during the fires and preserved in lacquered chests, bore testimony to paper's quiet omnipresence, not the object of glory, but the silent bearer of memory, without which victory and loss would alike be forgotten. Decades blurred into dynastic change, the Tang's grandeur yielding to new banners, new scripts, new anxieties. Luoyang's engines of reinvention throbbed on. But in the shadows of print shops and temple schools, Lin's way of making, a certain slowness, a devotion to invisible seams, carried forward, hunched beneath layers of forgetting. Now and then, a craftsman in the provinces would debate the proper mixture for a particularly fine sheet, invoking the rumor of a perfection achieved once, somewhere in the north. And in the rarest moments, a passing official, weighing a letter in his palm, would remark upon a certain translucency, a feather touch suggesting lineage. But these echoes, scattered and diluted, were not the legacy's sum. The craft's essence was not only in recipes or the finish of a page, but in the transmission of quiet care, a refusal to let the ephemeral vanish wholly, an insistence that even in times of collapse, something essential could be preserved, if only in the margins. Children running beneath ruined arches would sometimes find scraps still resisting ruin, the ink's pattern strange but hopeful. The city, rebuilt and battered again by centuries, kept absorbing the ghost of the old mill's rhythm, a thrum that could not be erased. Lin himself, like all who work in patient anonymity, left behind no monument. At the hill's edge, amid wild grass reclaiming the mill's stones, grew a single mulberry sapling. Each spring, its leaves unfurled with a reticent, ancient green, fragile veins, resembling not so much the glory of lineage as the secrecy of persistence. Those who paused by this quiet place either by chance or seeking respite from the world's haste, sometimes felt a peculiar hush settle over them. It was the kind of peace that lingers after great storms, a feeling that the smallest acts, shaped by the hands of those nearly forgotten, sustain the world's passage from collapse to remembrance. Thus did the last papermaker's legacy persist, woven into the very air the city breathed. Not in the brittle splendor of conquest, nor in the brittle pages of chronicles alone, but in the recurring gesture of quiet making, the lifting of bark to water, the transformation of loss to archive, the conviction that something weightless, shaped with care, might outlast empires. Paper endures, Lin's silent creed inscribed between fibers, so that even when names and cities fade, the world knows, tremulously, how to remember. Dawn fell soft and gold across the river of Brantas, veiling the realm in a subtle mist that neither concealed nor revealed, but hovered, uncertain, akin to a held breath before a note. Within the palatial embrace of Trolan, the heart of Majapahit, the world beat with ceremonial deliberation. The fishmongers filed past low lotus ponds bearing the tang of morning catch. Couriers glided in vermilion robes, their shadows elongated and ironic against the flagstones, for they ferried tidings of peace or war with equal composure. At the core of this grand tapestry, where the air itself shimmered with the promise and peril of empire, dwelled the Gamelan master, Raka. The Gajakin, Majapahit's great Gamelan ensemble, reposed in the inner sanctum chased with ancient teak and curling incense, was a thing of myth and measure. It was said that, on a night of perfect stillness, its bronze keys retained whispers of 1,000 ceremonies, the metallic tang of old grief and fleeting triumph. Raka, broad-shouldered and limping from an old fall, was the last to know the secret notes that bound the empire to its ancestors. His hands, calloused yet deft, moved with the memory of rivers and wind. He was neither noble nor slave, but something in between, a craftsman suffused with dignity, wearing his tunic clean but plain, his hair bound in a careful knot. Every dawn, as the cicadas hesitated and the mangoes cast blunt shadows on the tiles, he arrived before the palace awoke, tracing each instrument with fingers sensitive as a lover's. The sarens and gender shimmered at his touch. He would murmur to the kendang, tightening the hide, coaxing a resonance pure as a newborn's cry. Each was a vessel. Each bore the scent of lamp oil and the memory of rain. On this morning, the air rang with a latent discord, as though the world itself were bracing for fracture. Palace servants spoke in lowered voices. A rumor had traveled upriver, a Javanese prince, embittered exile, gathering men near the forests of Blambangan. The queen herself, radiant and weary, had sponsored a new lotus pond, a hopeful gesture, Raka thought, with an undercurrent of dread. He felt it in his bones as he tuned the bonang, the cleft between worlds widening, the songs of harvest and war inseparable. Yet the court still demanded splendor. The courtyard swelled with courtiers, women in batik, so intricate it mimicked the rice fields from above, men with faces carved by the privations of ambition. Dancers, luminous in moonlight silk, rehearsed for another festival, another proof that the empire yet endured, and amidst them always, the Gajakin, a living memory kept from dissolution by Raka's will. Sometimes, He wondered what would remain when the last echo faded, when these bronzes were melted for spears, or carried off as war prizes into foreign kingdoms. Had he not already seen copper bells from Kediri, hung as trinkets round the necks of horses, or temple gongs carted away by men indifferent to their song? His father, too, had spoken of their family trade as charged not with pride, but with grief. We are the memory of those who will not remember us. But Raka was not all resignation. As twilight years curled round his heart, he bristled against the growing hint of irrelevance. Recent nights had brought dreams of starlit fields, pulsing with music untethered from courtly summons, spiraling into villages, riverbanks, through terraced paddies, where farmers straightened damp backs at dusk. In his reveries, the music was not just pageant or praise, but rebellion, a persistence, a refusal. Today, though, he faced the rituals as he always did, with meticulous devotion stitched by unvoiced fury. He oversaw rehearsal, brow furrowing as a young Slenthem player faltered, her fingers trembling. He guided her hand, whispering, "Feel, not just count. The pulse is beneath the skin, not above it." The girl's cheeks reddened, but something kindled in her gaze. Even here, tradition lived and stretched. In the mid-morning hush, as the palace walls grew hot and sunbeams sliced through the Gamelan hall's latticed screens, the court priest arrived. A thin man robed in ghostly white. Twining his fingers in complicated apology, he addressed Raka, quietly urgent. "Tonight, you must play for the Council of War. The Queen has decreed it. She fears the gods are fickle." Raka bowed his head, not in assent, but in concession to the role he played. His face masked what his soul knew. The notes of the Gajakin would soon be asked to conjure unity where only fracture remained. As the priest receded, Raka lingered with his instruments, the morning's light fracturing across plated bronze, each key a memory, each resonance a question. Soon the world would demand that he play not just for celebration or harvest, but in defiance of silence itself. Outside, the omens gathered, smoke coiling over distant villages, banners swelling like wounded birds. Yet here, in the cool dusk of the Gamelan hall, Raka's rebellion began in the hush before a note, the fierce belief that, if he tended this craft, this ancient, trembling sound, something might outlast even the darkness gathering at the imperial gates. After morning, rituals retreated into a haze of incense and fading audience. The hall of Gamelan emptied, leaving an intimacy thick as dusk between its silent ranks. Raka dismissed the apprentices with a wave, their whispered farewells lingering in the open doorways. Only the faint brush of their footsteps testified to their passage. The rest was silence, potent, precarious, laden with the things unsaid. He walked now among the instruments, their forms thrown long and solemn across the flagstones. The bronze faces, gong, kenang, peking, looked up at him as patient witnesses, waiting for the next invocation. Raka carried with him a cloth to polish, but more so he carried memory. The soft ache of lessons learned at a mother's knee, of secrets traded in childhood with the sound of cicadas humming outside the windowless hut of his first years. To craft and to tend, to coax resonance out of mute metal, was a discipline older than even kings remembered, reaching past the present splendor to tangled roots underground. He rested his hand lightly on the jagged edge of a sarin key. Once, after the passing of his father, he had taken to sleeping in the Gamelan room, wrapped in a shawl against the night's damp, listening for the faint shifts in the instruments as they cooled and settled. In those quiet midnights, every vibration was an oracle. The settling of a weak weld, the onset of a hidden crack. He had learned to remedy by ear what others saw only as surface. Every instrument bore a history of illnesses, a hairline flaw from casting, a warp acquired in the rainy season, dents wrought by careless players hungry for speed, but deaf to tone. But as the afternoon unfurled, Raka's thoughts cast further, beyond the sound and wood and metal, to the cracks spidering through the empire itself. News drifted in riddles, the tributaries late in their tribute, villages pulling back into uneasy silence. The market rumor that Balinese emissaries had offered sacred crease to the eastern vassals. Even in the Gajakan hall, the air felt tenser. Pride once wrapped the palace like smoke, but now Raka saw it falter, replaced by hurried glances, counselors speaking too quickly and too low. He sat, cross-legged on woven mat, in front of the massive gong ejeng resting at the center of the arrangement. A disc vast as a moon, dark, and slightly pitted from decades of ritual impact. It was from this heart, this stillness, he took counsel with his ghosts. To strike the gong was to call ancestors, to recall not just triumph, but penance. Raka pressed his ear to its cold edge. He whispered, as old habit dictated, a greeting to his forebears. May what we keep survive the silence. In the distance, a commotion broke the reverie, another courier galloping through the stone-laced garden, his cries pinched with desperation. Raka did not yet rise. He pondered instead the subtler disturbances, how tradition had withered not in the blaze of foreign swords, but in the silence between festivals, the slow forgetting wrought by peace as much as by conflict. Music's real enemy was not violence, but indifference. A tradition could vanish not with flames, but with neglect. He turned over in his palm a slender mallet, blackened by years of use. Its handle fit his grip as though grown for it alone. Raka recalled the first night he had been deemed worthy to play for the queen's ancestors. How tremulous his hand, how alive each moment. That night the air shimmered with a vibrating clarity, each note an oracle for the nation's fate. Now, he worried, their audience, be it venerated spirits or fidgeting courtiers, heard only a backdrop. The master's charge was no longer simply to perform, but to prevent forgetting. He stood and approached a collapsed rack, its strings loosened and useless. The rabob, carved from dark jackfruit wood and strung with fine horsehair, gazed up from the floor, disjointed, sapped of voice. He crouched, inspecting the split. His thumb traced the silky grain as if the instrument itself could speak, could tell him why the sacred thread had snapped. Some things, Raka acknowledged, broke quietly and without malice. The string would be mended, but the old resonance would take coaxing. A patient dialogue, not a demand. His own body bore such wounds, healed over with imperfect symmetry. From the shade beyond the door, Lestari, his oldest apprentice, watched. She was quiet, but her eyes weighed everything. Raka beckoned her inside, holding out the inert rabob. Wordlessly, she accepted. The transmission of craft, he knew, moved as much through patience as through sound. The lingering on a fret here, the correction of a finger's pressure there. He watched her examine the break, her brow furrowed in determination and doubt. He saw in her the history of the trade, waning, but stubborn. Outside, preparations for the evening's war council began in earnest. The rising clamor of soldiers, the bite of burning sandalwood, the temple voices summoning benediction. Inside, Raka guided Lestari's hands along the wounded instrument, offering soft instruction. The way of defeat, the hope of salvage. Over time, the silent strings would yield, not to force or ritual alone, but to an unyielding attention, a practice of almost reverence. His quiet rebellion was seated in this sharing, not grand, but inexorable, a refusal to let meaning slip, even as tradition weakened in the spaces between music and quiet. Midday leaned to dusk. Raka knew he would soon call the hall to order for the night's performance, summoning not just song, but something larger, the aching persistence of memory. As the palace corridors darkened and shadows crept among the ancient bronze, he resolved anew that every silent string, every compromise, every act of unseen mending was itself a kind of subversion, a defiant reminder that not all losses would go unopposed. As dusk filtered slowly across the velvet canopy of Trolan, the palace drew its breath and readied itself for ceremony. Night's embrace was neither welcoming nor aloof, but measured, each lamp's flicker arranged by the hand of order, each footfall sounded with deliberate precision. Within the Gamelan chamber, a palpable anticipation gathered, a hush stretching between the courtiers dressed in layers of gold-threaded cloth, the sentinels with their spears like exclamation points against the colonnades, and the musicians who watched Raka for the signal to begin. This night, the Queen's Council convened amid a rift of anxiety, the air striated by the scent of perfumed wood and the sharper tang of anticipation. There had been word of fire in the outlying fields, provinces wavering between loyalty and boldness. For some, these omens were mere politics, ebbing tides of fortune. For Raka, seated before the Gajakin like a priest before an altar, it was an overture to something deeper, the battle between remembrance and forgetting, waged not by swords but by sound. He met Lestari's eye. Her hands, now steadier, anchored the newly mendied rabob. Around them, other apprentices assembled, Sutino, precise and wide-eyed, with the Bonang, Eka, thoughtful and frail, tending the cider. They arranged themselves, a quietly courageous bulwark, across from the older musicians who played from memory as much as training. Raka sensed in this mingled company a tension he knew well, the urge to prove oneself, to play not simply the proper note, but to leave a mark, however faint, on the dusk. He raised his hand, palm flat, a silent invocation, the mallets poised. The breathless moment, always so brief, seemed elastic tonight, stretching across worlds. Then came the first note, a single, deep chime from the gong ejeng, resonant enough to set the very lattice screens vibrating, the music unspooled, tentative, then surging, echoing between the carved pillars and up into the painted rafters, where stylized herons watched with enigmatic approval. The court expected splendor, but this was different. Raka let dissonance creep in, subtle shadows alongside the familiar melody. He altered the cadence, inserting silences where rapture usually crowded. The harmonies clashed, then reconciled, in patterns new to the hall and unsettling to those who equated tradition with repetition. Some courtiers shifted uneasily. A stray ambassador frowned into his sleeve, but others listened, uncertain, gripped by the unfamiliar tension made audible, an ode not to certainty, but to the pulse of doubt and survival. For Raka, this was revolt, an assertion that the ancient forms could still hold space for the living world that pressed against them, unruly and unresolved. The instruments answered one another in languages older than memory, sharp retorts of the kenang, the introspective sighs of the rabab, the sudden cascade of the gambang as Lestari's fingers found confidence in her sorrow. Where the music once carried the scent of routine, tonight it smelled of smoke, wind, and procession, shifting, elaborate, impossible to forget. At the council's periphery, the queen sat composed, her crown haloed with steady lamplight. It was said she favored tradition, yet as the strangeness deepened, she neither signaled displeasure nor praise. Instead, her gaze wandered over the musicians, the murmuring rows of advisors, the silent priests whose faces betrayed neither hope nor cynicism. In those moments, the music became not only a gift for the ancestors, but a kind of suasion, a case argued for the persistence of soul amid uncertainty. Raka felt the risk. He had breached the shallow comfort that so often insulated ceremony from reality. But as the composition spiraled, at times convulsive, at times delicate, he watched the apprentices lean into their parts, weaving threads that belonged to no one master. What emerged was at once a confession and a protest, the willingness to name the fracture and still find resonance. As the set concluded, a final low tide of sound receded. It left the chamber suffused with an energy dense and amber, the aftertaste of something said rather than ritual merely performed. The queen nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. Courtiers refrained from the usual applause, silence hanging as if speech itself required reconsideration. Raka beckoned his ensemble aside as servants moved to clear the hall. In the private hush that followed, he spoke in a tone seldom used in public. Tonight, we did not merely repeat the past, we questioned it. The world is restless. Let our music answer not by retreat, but by stretching memory until it holds what the present brings. His students regarded him with something akin to reverence. Lestari, still clutching the rabab, asked quietly, "Will the queen understand?" He considered, gaze moving between his circle and the extinguished lamps. "She need not. It is enough that we heard ourselves, each and together." And in that moment, the rebellion was not loud, not thunder, but something more enduring. A resonance carried beyond the hall, through corridors perfumed by old jasmine, down to the city's sleeping stone, where it might take root and one day be remembered by a world still learning to listen. It was with the dawn after the council that a subtle transformation pressed upon Trolan, discernible in the faint drag of banners against the wind and the uneasy hush on palace grounds. For the musicians, the night's resonance lingered not as triumph, nor as admonition, but as the memory of something set loose, a slow, subterranean awakening. Raka walked the palace perimeter in the cool, tentative light, passing beneath frangipani heavy with dew. Unlike the shock of upheaval, change here traveled in small increments. Coral-tinted petals accumulating in gutters, the measured scraping of brooms in open corridors, the careful conversations among kitchen workers. Lestari and the apprentices, too, seemed changed, as if the altered music of the night before had worked its way into the sinew of their hands. Raka watched them practice in the shaded alcove, their rhythm hesitant at first, then gaining confidence, emboldened, perhaps, by the knowledge that tradition had proven permeable, that even ceremony could be remade without splintering. In the market, murmurs traveled in slender threads. The new music had unsettled some, delighted others. Local elders, summoned by curiosity, exchanged measured glances, recalling tales of performances when the world was younger and more volatile. Gossip among the traders revealed both unease and admiration, interwoven as tightly as warp and weft in finely woven cloth. A visiting merchant from Sumatra, lingering beside a basket of nutmeg, queried, "Who guides the instruments now?" His tone was wary, edged with respect. Even uncertainty became a form of reverence when the future rested on intangible things. Inside the palace, the queen summoned Raka for a private audience. The hall was emptied of all but a pair of silent guards. Between them, the room seemed immense, almost vulnerable. Rays of morning filtered in, painting pools of pale gold across the marble. The queen sat unadorned, her crown absent, her manner lighter yet sharpened by the weight of what she must carry. "Last night," she began, her voice gentle but precise, "was a crossing." Her gaze swept the empty space, as if seeing through the centuries woven into the walls. "Do you believe music carries power even when its meaning is uncertain?" Raka, standing as upright as his years allowed, did not answer at once. He recalled the trembling hush after the final note, how the lack of easy resolution had pressed upon the room, how each participant seemed to absorb and privately reckon with that unrest. "Power rarely asks permission," he replied at last. "A song shapes the world as much as rule or battle, but its trace is fainter. What endures is not always what is remembered." She inclined her head, considering. "We are told the empire is indivisible, that ancestors watch and approve. Yet what of the spaces left when tradition thins?" He hesitated, then allowed himself a smile, worn and unembellished. "Tradition is not a wall. It is a threshold, a place we step across. And sometimes, what echoes beyond is stronger than what is contained." They sat in silence, the stillness neither tense nor resigned. When the queen finally dismissed him, Raka departed without further words, a little less burdened, a little more aware of the margin between fate and stewardship. Later, as the heat mounted and the city's pace resumed, Raka found himself at the outskirts, where paddy fields brushed against forest. Here, children chased clouds of dragonflies and mimed the dances of festivals, their laughter tossed along the dikes. Under the limp shadow of a banana tree, he encountered Pak Ranu, an elder who remembered the kingdom before its reach had extended so far. They sat cross-legged on woven mats, watching the shimmer on the water and listening to the distant, accidental song of farm tools striking stone. "These days," Pak Ranu murmured, "old things vanish and no one marks the hour." His eyes followed a heron poised at the edge of the mud. "But the river carries all things before it finds the sea." Raka traced absent lines in the dust. "Perhaps remembering is not holding tight, but releasing, letting our own stories become tributaries." A wind picked up, and with it, a faint echo of the gamelan carried from the palace, a melody wafting in indistinct form, reshaped by distance and breeze. Children's heads turned. For an instant, their games fell still. This, too, Raka realized, was a kind of rebellion, the persistence of form within alteration, an echo refusing extinction, asserting itself amidst play and toil alike. That evening, Lestari brought word that soldiers were striking the gongs in the barracks, trying to imitate the sounds of festival, clumsily, roughly, with gusto rather than grace. She related the tale with a grin half mocking, half in awe. "Will they never learn?" she asked, feigning despair. Raka chuckled, his voice softer now. "They will learn in ways we do not choose, Sometimes a thing must be broken and made anew. That is how seeds find soil. As the sky deepened and the first stars winked over the horizon, Raka looked past the city walls, imagination stretching towards times yet unwritten. The rhythms he had stirred into being did not stop at the chamber's end. They lived, transformed in the echo carried on night air. A question, a memory, a half-glimpsed promise that drifted, weightless, beyond the tightened borders of an uncertain age. At the trembling fringe of Babylon's waning days, dust rose in choked spirals where tides of empire once streamed with certainty. The courtyards, haunted by the hard edges of silence, resonated with the memory of footfalls, officials, sandaled strides, priests in quiet debate, merchants with their hopeful eyes. Now stone and sunlight bore mute witness as an empire's last language withered in the folds of its own dusk. Among the shadows within the library's labyrinth, Arid moved with the careful urgency that only those who love the fragile things of the world know. The young apprentice to the royal scribe, son of a potter, fostered by words instead of wet clay, finding his being in the geometry of wedge and curve pressed into damp earth. The grand record hall was no longer a sanctum, but a vault under siege. Cuneiform, once the engine of state and priesthood, traveled now only through Arid's hands and those of his master, Bel-Marduk. The older man stooped, his hair an ashen thread, had summoned Arid before dawn, his voice grave, and pressed into his palm a clay shard inscribed with a new and final edict. From the palace, he said, and Arid heard fears hush beneath duty's weight. This small slab, no larger than Arid's hand, bore a chiseled script unlike their own. The shapes, though familiar in form, pronounced the future in a language not theirs, Aramaic, flowing like a river over the broken banks of Cuneiform. Outside, the first crimson of morning frightened the sky, casting a ruddy sheen over the city's tallest ziggurat. From the library's high window, Arid saw movement within the temple precinct, Persian banners, newly unfurled, and the pale, swift forms of soldiers at drill. Their presence was not new, yet the stillness that morning tasted of finality. Arid descended the steps into the archive, his breath shallow against the reek of burning oil and the bitterness of stirred dust. Rows of shelves, each heavy with the fixed voices of centuries, snaked away into indefinite gloom. The scent of old earth and drying reed ink comforted him. Here, the world was permanent, time captured in tablets. He pressed his palm to the worn side of one, a tax record 3 kings old, witness to 1,000 vanished transactions. Near the main vault, he found his master standing before a brazier now kindled with bright flame. Towering baskets bristled with thousands of tablets, histories, contracts, prophecies, grievances, love's quiet ledger, all waiting as if for ceremony. Bel-Marduk turned, his face hollowed, mouth thin. The Persians decree, our scribes, our tongues, our marks, all dissolved, all replaced. This, he raised the foreign tablet, is the king's word now. The words clotted Arid's throat. All his master's silence was answer enough. The raw air quivered as Bel-Marduk began the terrible work. Each tablet, precious in its singularity, was consigned to fire, or, for the less damning, hurriedly packed, their destinations secret. The burning was not wanton. It was a ritualized erasure, as if by honoring the tablets with fire, a sliver of their meaning might escape annihilation. Stones spoke in the hiss and pop of clay yielding to heat, with every cartload spilled into the orange mouth of the brazier. The language of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar dissolved into ascending soot. Arid's hands shook as he gathered a stack. Letters, mainly bonds and tariffs. He traced the familiar signs. Angled cuneiform, pressed with deft certainty by men lost generations ago. The characters felt alive, reluctant to pass into the hungry dark. Arid remembered childhood mornings in his father's courtyard, watching doves in the dust and mapping their steps in the chalky earth. Cuneiform was no different, the movement of life made permanent by touch, and now unmade by decree. He worked alongside others. The elder archivists wept quietly, fingers curled around relics of their own lives. Along the corridor, apprentices further along in their studies whispered laments in Sumerian, the tongue of ancestors, each syllable falling heavy, damp, with the ache of things disappearing. One, a girl not much older than Arid, pressed her lips to a tablet before surrendering it to flame as if parting with kin. All this played out in the shadow of columns, and among the red embers hazing the air, a ballet of sorrow and acceptance, writ small. The night before, Arid had dreamt of the god's hands shaping the river's path, a memory of his grandmother's old story, told in the hush beneath woven blankets. In his vision, Tiamat's waters drowned the low fields, sweeping clean what men had made, and from the shallows, a lone figure emerged, clutching not sword or scepter, but a tablet defiant, dense with sign. He thought of that now, watching fire eat through history, and felt that same futility, that desperate hope. Perhaps something would remain, if not in stone, then in memory's quicksilver clay. By noon, the chamber was dense with ash. The tablets gave up their bodies, one after another. The task was relentless, yet no anger rose. The end was not a convulsion of violence, but a slow, exhausted laying down of arms. Arid moved through the thinning ranks of the archive, the Persian edict growing heavier in his sash. He stared often at the writing, its fluidity alien, its authority absolute. With every whispered instruction from Bel Marduk, destroy these, hide those, keep this if you dare. Arid understood what was slipping through his fingers, not only texts, but the web of identity spun from language itself. In these silent hours, Arid glimpsed not the glory of conquest, but the tremor at history's pulse. The world was being remade in letters not his own. As dusk stretched over Babylon, the flames guttered low, and the last cuneiform tablets flickered, briefly incandescent, before giving themselves to the deepening dark. In the hollow quiet left behind, Arid pressed his palm to the ashy stones, vowing, if only silently and to himself, that he would remember. Even should all else be erased, he would hold their meaning close, a single ember in the gathering gloom. In the ochre haze of the following morning, Babylon's heart pulsed with an uneasy stillness, as if even the sun had dimmed out of respect for all that had been consigned to oblivion. A scorched Tang clung to the city's breath, threading through the ceremonial courtyards, over the cool tiles of the half-dark scriptorium, and along the winding alleys where children once chanted the syllables of kings. Ash from the nights, ritual sifted through open windows, fine as powdered bone, settling into the creases of clay, yet untouched by feverish flames. Arid emerged from a fevered rest and found the library's emptiness more acute. Without the low drone of tablets being carved, without Bel Marduk's methodical pacing, or the frequent laughter of fleeting visitors, The halls felt orphaned, ancient, exposed, mute. He drifted along shelves, as if searching for something neither named nor fully lost. A sense of responsibility grew in him, weighty as a sealed tablet. If they could not save the city's records, perhaps some kernel could endure, secret and whole, beyond the reach of those who insisted that pasts must die so futures might rule. The Persians had not banned memory. Not yet. As the main study chamber slumbered in pale light, Arid slipped past the charred brazier, now cold. He paused reverently before the niche where his mentor, Bel-Marduk, sat hunched over a flat stone, the royal decree laid out before him, as if divining from entrails rather than interpreting policy. They will inventory what remains, the old scribe rasped, fingers smoothing rose mud from his beard. Whatever is found after the tally is forfeit. Arid, listen, not all knowledge must die outright. Hidden beneath his master's robes, Arid spotted a bundle, tablets wrapped in reed mat, sealed with wax. These are the last of the poet's verses, the law of Ina's precinct, the herbal lists from Eridu. Take them, hide them well. Choose others if you dare. The final words left unsaid, do what I am now too visible, too exhausted to attempt. For a heartbeat, the future balanced on the palm of Arid's trembling hand. He remembered the child's game of shells. Shuffle them fast, conceal the kernel, trust your wits. Now it would be the cunning of shadows, not play. At the edges of comprehension, he saw history itself recede, not in thunder or lamentation, but through the quiet choreography of a boy and a bundle, slipping between the waking city's blind moments. Arid petitioned the library's dwindling staff with casual queries, requests for blank tablets, styluses, binding reeds, careful not to betray urgency. He moved through the outbuildings with a scribe's typical, harmless invisibility, yet within his linen tunic, beneath the innocuous satchel, he bore the lifeblood of a civilization. The records he selected, feeling them beneath his shirt pressed tighter with every turn, were modest yet immense. A hymn in Sumerian, the boundary of a field marked in the reign of Nabonidus, a fragmentary star chart, a merchant's untallied debts, each one a testament, a fragment of the mosaic. With every tablet saved, others were abandoned, and Arid felt the shadow of each decision, their phantom weights accumulating behind his ribs. He moved with care, hour after hour, feigning the stitching of ledgers, noting the comings and goings of palace officials dispatched by the Persian general. They strode through Babylon's precincts, tallying, pointing, their voices a strange melody, Aramaic's softer contours replacing Akkadian's ancient bones. Sometimes, Arid thought he heard complaint in his master's voice as he coached the newcomers. So you press the reed thus. No, not so firm. And here, the sign for barley. But mostly, Bel-Marduk taught with the precision of a man committed to survival, guiding even invaders with that one sacred dance of sign and silence. Twilight blushed over the rooftops as Arid stole to the garden behind the scriptorium, its soil cool and fragrant. Along one wall, behind the thick stems of papyrus and bitter green halhalu, he discovered a sunken jar, unused since the last famine. One by one, he slid the precious tablets within, layering them between reeds, clay discs, and a panel of salt to draw away time's dampness. Hands caked in earth and sweat, he murmured to himself the half-remembered prayers of his childhood, not for intercession, but for remembrance, a quiet invocation to keep the old words living beneath the garden's roots. The work was clumsy and anxious. Once, Startled by the footfalls of a Persian surveyor, Arid nearly toppled his satchel. He recovered, heartbeat wild, brushing dust from his face and mouth, then greeted the intruder with a mixture of reverence and ignorance practiced by survivors of every regime. The man, tall and fair-bearded, spoke to him in halting Akkadian, asking after the storerooms of the priests. Arid, feigning calculation, pointed toward the ruined granary, his performance so convincing that he caught a flash of satisfaction flicker over the soldier's face. Only when the garden lay shrouded in dusk did he finally replace the capstone on the jar. Inside, the scriptorium's gloom rang with the absence of voices. Arid sat beside Bel-Marduk and showed him an innocuous tablet, a dull inventory, unremarkable, but for an acrostic, a secret marker scratched into its margin. The old man's eyes gleamed, damp with pain and pride. "Each one that remains," he whispered, "is an oath fulfilled. Remember them all by heart and by hidden sign. What escapes the eye may wait for the world to change." That night, as Arid lay on his reed mat, sleepless, he recited the names of all he had saved and all he had lost. His mind's tongue curled around the shape and taste of words. For grain, for day, for peace, for return. Outside, the city murmured in new tones. Within, the old speech clung stubborn as roots to soil, not yet leached of memory. He did not know whether any god attended the rebellion of a young scribe. Perhaps none did. But beneath the garden, in layered darkness, Babylon's true tongue persisted, waiting. And Arid understood, while empire and record might burn in the world's fire, memory, if nourished, grew stubborn as shoots that waited for rain. Arid awoke to the measured drip of water from the cracked masonry overhead, an unhurried reminder that beneath Babylon's most luminous facades, there ran an undertow of endurance, resistant to sun or conquest alike. He had survived the previous day's dread with a secret lodged in the earth. Yet the uncertainty haloed each action. Never had the city's morning felt so brittle, or the library's corridors so changed. The architecture of authority still stood, massive and imposing, but its essence had begun to leach away like pigment from a pot left in the rain. The administrative machinery, once as ordered as the scribe's hand over clay, now ground forward out of hollow habit. Persian officials conferred beneath the battered blue tiles of the Ishtar Gate, their language trailing behind them like new cloth, elegant, flexible, and to Arid's ear, coldly indifferent to the world it had been imported to rule. Cuneiform's resonance was fading. Aramaic scripts began drifting across tablets in the hands of new notaries, styluses light, the strokes unfamiliar, the ink itself a quiet threat to the solidity of the old wedge marks. Returning in the early sunlight, Arid found Bel-Marduk hunched at the rear of the scriptorium. The master was no longer teaching with the same easy patience, but moved with a restlessness born of the dawning irrelevance of his vocation. He chiseled at a fragment, pausing often, as if half afraid each new word might render itself obsolete upon drying. "Remember, Arid," he murmured, not looking up, "to listen for more than what's written. The city speaks differently now. There is learning in silence, and in what dwells between the lines." The day unfolded as a procession of quiet errands, with the Persians assuming control over taxation and temple revenues. The role of scribes became measured, ceremonial, a nod to tradition kept only for pragmatic grace. Arid was summoned to observe the recording of new decrees. He took up his stylus, imitating indifference, inscribing laws that weighed in his hand not with the gravity of justice, but with the sterility of received command. Despite these outward gestures of submission, pockets of resistance bloomed in humble acts. The vendors in the market continued to use clay tokens bearing ancient signs, exchanging them in hurried transactions, believing in the persistence of the old tally. Priests muttered litanies in Akkadian behind the incense screens, their voices rising and wavering, touching memories older than empire. At dusk, Arid wandered through these spaces, absorbing the counterpoint, the hush and hum of continuity amid imposition. The temple complex, too, bore scars of transition. The great ziggurat's upper terraces, once alive with ritual and the measured clamor of petitioners, now echoed with emptiness. Where scribes had once read omens in celestial patterns, Persian observers now tallied grain, oblivious to augury's subtle warnings. But under this apparent surrender, Arid sensed a fidelity to the past, a half-hidden expectation, as though if one paused beside a weathered wall or listened to the sweep of a broom, the city's memory might flicker audibly through the quiet. His own evenings filled with study, not of the language that usurped his own, but of those cuneiform tablets he could, in secrecy, visit. By borrowed lamplight, he reviewed lists of herbs from Eridu star catalogs, whose constellations seemed especially clear now, that the city's outer lights were fewer, and half-broken verses of a long-silenced poet who had written of both exile and return. Each tablet provided not only content, but a cadence, an echo of the hands that had pressed damp clay, intent on anchoring meaning for generations unseen. The more intensely the outer world shifted, the more Arid sought ways to safeguard inward continuity. He began to translate, quietly, experimentally, snatches of cuneiform into the budding forms of Aramaic and even Greek, careful to disguise these as mundane calculations or prayers for harvest. He was compelled not by official decree, but by the haunting sense that without transformation, understanding itself would fade. He did not believe that writing alone could outweigh empire, but it might survive as a whisper on the margin, a fugitive tune played by those willing to listen. Not all in the scribe's circle understood this double work. Some, especially the elders who had never spoken a word not inked in Akkadian, snubbed the change as betrayal. Yet a younger apprentice, Ina, watched him with a narrow, curious intensity. She approached him one evening, her voice careful and low. If we only ever remember as we are told, isn't that also letting ourselves be erased? Arid recognized in her the same hunger that pressed him forward, a defiant root stretching for water below the reach of fire. He shared with her cautiously a fragment from the secret stash, an ancient lyric. Together, they translated a single line into the new tongue, the syllables unfamiliar yet suffused with a resonance that transcended their shapes. Like reeds above the floodwater, our stories bend, but do not break, Ina read softly. They sat in silence, the air trembling as if a god's breath lingered near. Arid thought of how meaning, once pressed into earth, could seep into the open air, dispersed, but far from vanished. Outside, the city reknit itself in the rhythms of the conqueror, but Babylon's older pulse throbbed on. The dull clack of clay underfoot, a lullaby whispered in a language no longer writ official. The imperial presence was pervasive, yet Arid and his ilk strove to record not just the cold facts of conquest, but but the secret harmonies of change, fracture, and survival. They preserved what could be hidden, learned what must be learned, and forged new vessels for the voice that risked forgetting. Through it all, Arid learned to recognize the city's subtle answers to loss. In the laughter that returned, tentatively, to the market, in the dark, earth-sweet chambers of bakers, where bread was still marked with patterns recalling ancient feasts. In the sky above, where the brightest stars set not by Persian reckoning, but by Babylon's own measures, visible to those who still knew how to look. For in every echo, in every act of recollection, Babylon conspired not for immortality, but for the quiet dignity of being remembered well. As the first rains threaded the tiled roofs of Babylon and drove rivulets down patched walls, Arid found himself drawn into the city's luminous undercurrents, a world where language curled and transformed, where silenced sayings wove furtive lines into the crowded tapestry of daily life. True authority had shifted, yes, but beneath the surfaces, painted anew in the Persian manner, the living roots of spoken and remembered words tangled, resilient, tenacious in their own quiet ways. The official world now bristled daily with Persian dictation. Scribes convened within the former palace school to instruct Babylon's children in Aramaic, wrangling with the gentle, looping script laid out on wax tablets. Petitioners no longer greeted the city stewards in Sumerian or Akkadian, but in the sanctioned, fluid mode required by decree. So it went, day after day, stampings, pronouncements, even street disputes measured in foreign syllables, while cuneiform dulled beneath their feet. Yet Arid glimpsed how this declared order only ever reached so far. In the alleyways shadowed by mud-brick archways and fragrant with cedar, the city's language flickered, refusing final erasure. Shopkeepers, busy peddling lentils or salt, slid tokens still pressed with ancient wedge marks into curious palms. The chants of laborers during the repairs of the old southern rampart broke from Aramaic into guttural old prayers whenever supervisors turned away. At home, mothers whispered lullabies older than any script, their rhythms lodging in eager memories long before any new alphabet could claim them. Arid's own role grew paradoxical. In public, he attended court with the new order's scribes, demonstrating the neutral, precise rendering of commands. Privately, he convened in borrowed cellars and back alleys, gathering the brightest apprentices and the most mournful elders, those unwilling to surrender the embrace of their first words. Sometimes Ina joined him, her eyes keen as newly cut glass, her own voice unfurling forgotten metaphors. They gathered in dusk's hollow hour, tracing characters into damp sand, or passing reed styluses from hand to hand, rehearsing poems and proverbs for no ledger but memory. Their lessons became a navigation, not defiance but preservation, not loyalty to vanished kings, but to the architecture of their shared understanding. Arid began each gathering not with a sermon or a lament, but with a simple question inscribed in the dust. What does this sign call forth in you? Each answer differed, a mother's story, a farmer's wisdom, a song for rain, until the sign itself shimmered, less shape than living presence, infused by 100 telling voices. Through shared speech, new meaning edged in, each retelling polished away the clamor of conquest, revealing the undiminished stone beneath. It was Ina who observed that language, so seemingly fragile, moves beneath surface currents, always replenishing its own wellspring. They can command the tongue, but not thought, she whispered, as the group huddled in a dilapidated storeroom one stormy night. We are not the last scribes, only the first to remember differently. In that moment was a kind of liberation, an invitation to participate in continuity itself. Some began composing new hymns or riddles that blended cuneiform syllables with the flowing ease of Aramaic script, creating hybrid utterances, clumsy perhaps, but possessed of an earnest vigor. Meanwhile, Arid's translation efforts took on a fresh urgency. Each day, he copied verses, legal codes, and astronomical notes, sometimes threading cuneiform with small glosses in Aramaic or disguised Greek, never in full, lest a stray inspection betray his task, but with the deliberate scattering of seeds for future tongues. The labor absorbed him, a hushed joy in the secrecy. The smudge of clay on a thumb, the slight give of wet earth under a stylus, the sound of Ina reciting beside him, her cadence making ancient lines flicker with present meaning. Unbeknownst to many, these clandestine circles attracted others, merchants from distant cities, a Persian clerk keenly curious about old astronomers, a grain-weighing priest whose memory harbored the vanished ceremonies of Marduk's court. Bit by bit, Arid stitched together an informal kinship of learners and keepers, each one responsible, if only in a narrow way, for saving a song, remembering a word, or scribing a name in margins or on jars. Such efforts wove a new pattern in the life of the city. In the twilight before festival evenings, Arid would pass by gatherings where a child drew awkward cuneiform on the floor, cheered on by a grandmother who celebrated every crooked wedge. In temples between new prayers, old refrains occasionally surfaced, low and reverent, met with approval or silence, but never outright suppression. Market shouts blurred languages together. Akkadian bartered easily with Aramaic, the very noise of trade humming of histories, yet unfinished. Yet, for all these small victories, the pressure outside remained relentless. Persian magistrates continued to thin the ranks of Babylon's scribes, calling up new taxes and standards, replacing not only symbols, but also the very expectations of how memory served authority. Marduk, ever diminished, receded into his duties, his pride a worn thing. On Arid's rare visits, the old scribe would nod abstractly when told of these secret efforts. So the river divides, only to find itself again in a different channel. It was both blessing and warning, laced with resignation and hope. Sometimes, late at night, dreams would carry Arid back to the beginning, a wedge pressed into clay, the small satisfaction of the sign's perfection, the certainty that the world made sense as it could be captured, counted, and named. Awake, he saw that world dissolving around him, but instead of grief, there was a quiet insistence, a promise that as long as even one story was voiced, the chain would not be broken. He came to understand that what changed was not the disappearance of language, but its passage through silence and secrecy, transformed but unextinguished. As the rain finally gave way to starlight and the Euphrates glinted between the gardens, Arid stood near the riverbank and listened, not for the noise of the city, but for the undercurrent, stray echoes, scraps of verse, the creak of bridges breathing together in the damp night. Babylon endured, not in the stony syllables of decrees, but in the ordinary persistence of language, living, shifting, waiting, until the world was again ready to remember in full.